Today we will be covering the cell membrane and its functions. The cell membrane, as we have discussed before, is the outer layer of the cell. It is made up of a phospholipid bilayer, and so the membrane is commonly referred to as the lipid bilayer. Each phospholipid is made up of a polar head and a nonpolar tail. Remember that this has to do with the electrons that are shared between the atoms in the molecule and affects the solubility. Since water is a polar substance, the polar head of the phospholipid is hydrophilic, or water-loving, and the polar tail is hydrophobic, or water-hating. Here's an image showing the molecular structure of the phospholipid. In the hydrophobic head, here you can see the phosphate component. And here is the hydrophobic tail, which is a lipid chain. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. So what does this mean? Well, first, permeable means allowing passage, and since it is doing this selectively, we can deduce that only certain molecules are allowed to pass through. Because of the hydrophobic tails, only small nonpolar molecules can enter on their own. The membrane does not allow passage directly of large or polar molecules. The cell membrane is also commonly referred to as a fluid mosaic model. Proteins and carbohydrates are embedded in the lipid bilayer, making it mosaic in appearance. These molecules can move around, which makes it fluid. Certain proteins serve specific purposes in the membrane processes. Here are 4 types of proteins that are embedded in the membrane. There are protein channels, which are always open, gated protein channels, receptor proteins, and transport proteins. Other than the receptor, these are all involved in the transport of molecules across the membrane. Molecules can enter and exit the cell in multiple ways depending upon their property. If energy is not required, it is considered to be passive transport. If energy is required, it is considered to be active transport. Diffusion is an example of passive transport. Molecules can pass through the membrane along the concentration gradient. This means that they are moving from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration in order to reach equilibrium. In the image here, the purple dots represent molecules are moving from outside of the cell to inside because there's a higher concentration there than in the cytoplasm. Facilitated diffusion is a type of diffusion that uses a protein channel. This allows small polar molecules to pass through since they are not able to pass directly through the lipids. Here's an image showing facilitated diffusion. Osmosis is a term for the diffusion of water. Since water is polar, the diffusion is facilitated through a protein channel. Water is constantly moving in and out of the cell in order to maintain proper solute concentration. There are terms for the concentration of water and solute in a cell. A cell is hypotonic when there is a high concentration of solute and a low concentration of water inside the cell, and the opposite outside of the cell. A cell is hypertonic when there is a low concentration of solute and a high concentration of water in the cell, and the opposite outside of the cell. An isotonic solution is when there are equal concentrations on each side. This is usually the ideal situation for a cell. Too high or too low of a solute concentration inside the cell can cause trouble. If the cell is hypertonic, as we see here, water will move out of the cell, causing the cell to shrink or collapse. If the cell is hypotonic, shown here, the water will move into the cell, causing it to swell or burst. An isotonic cell has an even exchange of water into and out of the cell. And now for active transport. This is the transport of molecules against the concentration gradient. This requires energy and is done by transport proteins. And now let's review what we covered today. Okay, so passive transport occurs along the what? That's right, concentration gradient. Now, the cell membrane is what kind of model? Good, fluid mosaic, that is correct. Okay, and who can answer this one? Very good. The phosphate head is hydrophilic and the fatty acid tail is hydrophobic. Facilitated diffusion occurs through what? That's right, a protein channel. And that is the end of our lesson today. Here's an assignment for you to work on for the rest of the hour.